There are four people in our group. The four of us agreed upon 13 days on Sheldon Stern's The Cuban Missile Crisis in American Memory. Myself, Francis Michael Links, student number 1747077, will be talking about 13 days and relationship to historic events during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Jesse Summit, who will be talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kate Can, who will be talking about critical reflection, insight into the message 13 days says about war. Chantal Fuller, who will be describing the companion reading Cuban Missile Crisis in American Memory by Sheldon Stern and how the reading influenced her viewing of 13 Days. 13 Days is directed by Roger Donaldson. It is a docudrama based on the Cuban Missile Crisis from the perspective of the United States political leadership. 13 Days has been described as illustrating the power and peril of the American presidency in a dramatic exploration that captures the urgency, suspense, and paralyzing chaos of the Cuban Missile Crisis. 13 Days captivatingly displays the 13 days that shook the world and put the United States and the United Soviet Society of Russia on the brink of nuclear war. The movie starts with the scene of the American U-2 crash on a reconnaissance mission over Cuba that captures the Soviet Union in the process of placing missiles carrying nuclear warheads in Cuba. This leaves the American presidency and advisors to come up with a plan of action to prevent the activation of such weapons. Kennedy is determined to ensure the U.S. will not allow a missile threat. The Joint Chief of Staff advised immediate U.S. military strikes against the missile sites followed by an invasion of Cuba. However, Kennedy is reluctant to attack and invade Cuba as it would lead to greater international conflicts. Citing the guns of August, Kennedy sees the analogy to the events that started World War I. Due to Kennedy's reluctance to follow this course of action, him and his advisors tried to find a solution that would remove the missiles but avoid an active war. They settled on a step less than a blockade. They set up what they publicly describe as a quarantine zone. They announced the U.S. naval force will stop all ships entering Cuban waters and inspect them to verify they are not carrying weapons destined for Cuba. The Soviet Union sends mixed signals in return. A reporter from ABC News is contacted by a Soviet emissary, and through the spec channel communication method, the Soviets offer to remove the missiles in exchange for public assurances that the U.S. will not invade Cuba. A similar message is in the same tone is received, which is assumed to be from the Soviet premier. This is followed by a harsher message, which is assumed to be from the Politburo. There are several missteps during the crisis. The first is the defense readiness level of the Strategic Air Command was raised to DEFCON 2. Second, a nuclear weapon test proceeds and a routine test launch of a UN offensive missile is carried out, both without the authorization of the President. In a bid for time when under intense pressure from the military for an immediate attack, Kennedy approves the Joint Chiefs plan. A reconnaissance plane is sent to gather intelligence for the attack. This plane is shot down. Kennedy makes the final attempt to avoid war by sending his brother to meet with the Soviet ambassador. The ambassador puts forward the same conditions which conveyed in the message from the Soviets: removal of Jupiter missiles from Turkey, and assurances of no attacks or invasion of Cuba. The US agrees to this on condition they have 6 months to remove the Jupiter missiles. The Soviets announced they will remove their missiles from Cuba, thus preventing a war that could escalate to the use of nuclear weapons. The film ends with President Kennedy dictating a letter of condolence to the family of the reconnaissance pilot. 13 Days is loosely based on the Kennedy tapes inside the White House during the Cuban Missile Crisis by Ernst May and Philip Zelikow, but is also based upon recordings basically by JFK. Although it is based on these sources, it takes great dramatic license which causes some historical inaccuracies throughout the movie. However, even though these inaccuracies, it is still far more accurate than past productions would cause it to be certainly original. It can be widely agreed that even though 13 Days is not a documentary, it accurately demonstrates central themes that are faithful to what happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis. 13 Days is dramatization, and due to this, it gets a number of historical facts wrong. It is often putting the right words into the wrong mouth. Inflating O'Donnell's role, however, it is only once or twice that he says something that he might not actually have done or said. O'Donnell is normally the type of person historians usually neglect. Inflating O'Donnell's role was to offer an inside man It saw everything going on but was not a policy contestant, thus evaluating the crisis from the point almost as an ordinary citizen. Caricaturing the military leadership as a warmongering monolith, miniaturizing most of the other advisors. The movie skews many small points and a few large ones, but this is due to depicting such a large time frame in such a small time. 13 Days is scrupulously accurate on the small matters which cause it to be criticized in the big matters. 13 Days does get two things right. The world was closer to nuclear war than it ever was before or since. President Kennedy did a hell of a job. The historical accuracy of 13 Days can be seen in three different ways. For presentation that was a real crisis in the medical sense of involving life and death. The mounting risk of local catastrophe, it accurately reproduces the restraint within the White House at the time. It incorporates realistic footage of Soviet missile sites in Cuba and of American U-2s swooping over the sites and of bombers, carrier aircrafts, and US missiles preparing for action. It can be said that even with all these inaccuracies, 13 Days is still the most accurate production on the Cuban Missile Crisis. Due to this, 13 Days has, and still is, good historical starting point for any individual looking to start studying the.
Thank you, Francis. The following section of the presentation will cover a short summary on the war and conflict which the film 13 Days is based on. So, without further ado, let's begin. This film depicts one of the major conflicts which erupted between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. This conflict was, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis. This crisis was the closest event to an outbreak of nuclear warfare between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Before the outbreak of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Berlin had been a point of disagreement and contention between Nikita Khrushchev, the Premier of the Soviet Union, and John F. Kennedy, the President of the United States. The erection of the Berlin Wall, which began on August 15, 1961, heightened tensions between the two leaders. Also during this time, the United States had a tense relationship with its close neighbour Cuba. Tensions between the two nations had been growing since the United States' failed attempt to invade Cuba's Bay of Pigs in April of 1961. This left Kennedy and his government embarrassed and humiliated, while infuriating Cortez, the president of Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis did not occur instantaneously. There are reports which indicate the United States was aware from as early as July of 1962 that the Soviet Union had started shipping missiles to Cuba. As the film presents, the Soviet Union, under the direction of its premier, Nikita Khrushchev, did move and assemble missiles in Cuba to use against the United States, which he had approved on the 10th of June 1962. Confirmed sightings of Soviet missiles and soldiers were presented to John F. Kennedy on the 15th of October 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis was handled with extreme care, and like the film, John F. Kennedy introduced naval quarantine on October 22nd. This was a move by John F. Kennedy and the Executive Committee of the National Security Council to deter the Soviet Union. Fortunately, this crisis was amicably resolved by the 27th and 28th of October 1962. Both Khrushchev and Kennedy agreed to remove their missiles. This meant the Soviet Union withdrew its missiles from Cuba and the United States removed their missiles from Turkey. Cuba's leader, Fidel Castro, was annoyed by Khrushchev's decision to remove the missiles from Cuba. Scholar Arthur Cry wrote, "The 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest the world has come to general nuclear warfare." Cry also believes the Cuban Missile Crisis was John F. Kennedy's finest hour, and his actions were considered wise. Unfortunately, the agreement between Kennedy and Khrushchev was not enough to end the Cold War.
During this part of the presentation, I'll be critically reflecting on the film 13 Days and what the movie's message about war is. So, as has already been discussed, this film is a dramatic representation of the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis and is largely looking at the American response to the situation. The film establishes some important messages about the nature of war, some of which are perhaps specific to the Cold War era, and other messages which reflect on more universal norms when it comes to warfare. There are three main messages which I drew from the film about war, which I will be discussing in this section of the presentation. These are the vital yet often conflicted relationships between the military and political leaders, the prevailing attitude that war is men's business, and the tenuous nature of war, which is demonstrated by how the media and civilian population are seen to impact the progression and the outcome of the crisis. First and foremost, a dominant message throughout the film is the conflicted relationships between the military and political leaders. This relationship is demonstrated as vital, as often the political leaders defer to the military leaders for pertinent and critical information regarding weapons capabilities, logistics, and situational awareness. For example, one of the more important questions that JFK asked the military leaders at the initial consultation meetings regarding the missiles is how long until they are operational. This demonstrates the value of military input into wartime decision-making. However, it is also quickly established that military and political leaders often have conflicting agendas for warfare. The military leaders see the political leaders as weak and lacking decisiveness, with one general commenting that the Kennedys are going to get us all killed due to their lack of offensive action, whereas the military leaders are presented as too quick to shed blood, war-hungry, and immoral. The rift between the ideals of the political and military leaders is further demonstrated when the military leaders begin making decisions without presidential approval. The president and his team successfully averts this crisis escalating into a full-scale nuclear war, but had a different decision been made about how to respond, this may not have been the case. This demonstrates that the outcome of war in the modern world is not only about the size of one's army or the field tactics employed, but about effective decision-making through consultation between several invested parties. A second major message which is portrayed in the film is the attitude that war is men's business. By this, I mean that warfare is a domain which is dominated by men, and that when it comes to decision-making about when and how to engage in war, this is left up to the males in leadership. The film backs up this notion, as the initial and consequential meetings which are held in response to the discovery of the missiles are done in rooms of male political and military leaders. There is no female input into the decision-making process regarding the crisis, and the few female characters shown in the film have nothing or very little to say about the crisis. Whilst this is also possibly a reflection of the period in which the film is set, it is nonetheless a prominent feature of the film, in that female characters are scarce, and when they are depicted, they are largely inconsequential to the storyline. Whilst it is difficult to ascertain whether this male dominance in war-related phenomena, which continues in the present day, is due to the glass ceiling effect women might encounter within defence systems, as within many organisations, I think there is a valid and strong argument that this male dominance is more so a result and reflection of universal prevailing attitudes that war is more suited to men, to male attitudes and levels of aggression, and that the male disposition in general qualifies men to dominate in the decision-making processes concerning war as seen in the film. Another message which is put forth by the film is the tenuous nature of war, which is demonstrated by the impact of the media and civilian population on the progression and outcome of the crisis. There are careful measures taken in the film to ensure that the media does not initially get hold of the missile crisis information for fear of public mass panic, and the effect this could have on how the crisis plays out. At one point, JFK himself calls the publisher of a newspaper to ask that he does not run a story on the crisis, as it is at a crucial point in the settlement process with the Soviet Union, and running with the story could ruin the settlement. This demonstrates how war is a tenuous ordeal that can be easily swayed by public opinion, and for this reason the public is not always made aware of operational information, and the timing and extent of the release of such information is crucial to the outcome of the war.
Sheldon M. Stern is a historian and author who specializes in the Cuban Missile Crisis. He has written many books and articles on the situation, and most recent being The Cuban Missile Crisis in American Memory, Myths versus Reality. He claimed to write this book to close a critical gap in the historiographical record, as he believes the myths surrounding the event during the Cold War are believed more than the factual evidence, such as the recently declassified White House recordings from John F. Kennedy's presidency, including the Cuban Missile time. Stern was a Kennedy Library historian, and this allowed him access to the recordings before they had been declassified, which gave him a primary source to better understand these critical 13 days. He used these tapes to demonstrate the immense pressure Kennedy was under in order to protect the world from nuclear warfare. Stern uses both the tapes and the other declassified information, especially those from the Soviet Union, as most of the recounts of the crisis were influenced by Washington and American perspective. New research suggests that it was Castro who wanted Khrushchev to engage in the first nuclear strike against the United States of America if they invaded Cuba. However, the Soviet Union official believed this to be a request for the first nuclear strike in nuclear warfare and refused. The position of Khrushchev is again seen during his reaction to Soviet soldiers located in Cuba shooting down an American U-2 plane. He claimed that they were acting upon their own accord and their actions were both careless and destructive. It is now understood that John F. Kennedy did make the correct choice when deciding not to perform a retaliatory attack, despite stating it would occur days before. This new information is excluded from the film 13 Days, possibly to provide a certain position of the audience towards the actions of the president and to support American patriotism. By leaving out his want to attack the Soviet base, which fired upon his aeroplane, it can be seen that he was always calm and collected. Stern uses his book to defend the authenticity of the White House recordings and continues to explain how it would be almost impossible for these to be fabricated, as it was only John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy who knew they were being recorded. Despite the two of them knowing, Stern also believes they would have found it immensely difficult to influence responses, emotions, and conversations between themselves and the rest of the ex-com officials. He wholeheartedly believes that what was said by the president and his brother were influenced by their situation and their personal morals, not to benefit their own position. The film 13 Days is loosely based upon these recordings, but also includes the Hollywood drama required for films to become a blockbuster. The film differs from factual evidence by giving more responsibility to Kenny O'Donnell, the character portrayed by actor Kevin Costner, possibly to avoid introducing too many characters into the film, and also to grow the character of O'Donnell, allowing for a well-known actor such as Costner to be willing to play the role. The film also ignores the acts of recording the conversations in the White House and discards the actions of the United States in searching for evidence and motives behind Cuba's acquisition of the missiles, as well as the motives behind Fidel Castro and Nikita Khrushchev. Another way Stern's book suggests the film was not historically accurate was through its portrayal of Robert Kennedy. The film suggests he is more placid and on par with its own recollection of the events, as stated in Robert Kennedy's book 13 Days, when compared to the recorded tapes. Upon reading Stern's book, it can be understood that the film does give a relatively accurate portrayal of the events, important people, and dialogue of the crucial 13 days. However, the film does have an essence of Hollywood flair, in which some scenes are over-dramatized, certain words have been said by different characters, which has been most likely to shorten the running time of the film, and of course the different portrayals of Robert Kennedy to a position he himself favoured. Due to this, the film cannot be seen as a documentary of the events. However, it was never intended to. It does give the audience an abridged version of arguably the most terrifying